want to acknowledge our university and community supporters, the University of Iowa's international programs and the University of Iowa's honors program. They contribute vital time, talent, and logistics to our organization. I also thank the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization for their financial support, and I thank today's special financial sponsors, Karen and Wallace Chapel and Midwest One Bank. Our programs are made possible by the financial support of these sponsors. Now I'd like to introduce Hugh Farrer, who will introduce our speaker.
When I think about how this year's program is creating community, my thoughts very quickly turn to today's speaker, who I'm honored to introduce. It's very hard to put into words how community gets built. I think ICFRC is doing it. I think there's many organizations in Iowa City that are doing it. IWP is doing its part. And in talking with Rachel about what is familiar in the spirit that she brings to this year's residency, one of the things we hit upon is that Canada shares America's volunteer spirit. That it's a lot of its community resources are developed through volunteerism. And as Rachel just said to me a few minutes ago, to come to Iowa City and to not try and connect with the people here would be such a wasted opportunity. So it's my honor to introduce her. She's an award-winning Canadian poet and nonfiction writer, the recipient of a 2013 and an upcoming 2016 Pushcart Prize. She's the winner of the Pat Lowther Poetry Award and the Andre Lord Poetry Award, both in 2013. Her poetry books include Notes on Arrival and Departure, and Song and Spectacle. Her creative nonfiction essays have appeared in a number of anthologies, including Double Lives, Writing, and Motherhood. She's the Poet Laureate of Vancouver and participates this year courtesy of the British Columbia Arts Council and the Canada Council. Please welcome Rachel Rose.
Thank you so much, Hugh. I am delighted to be here. As Hugh said, I'm Rachel Rose, and I'm the Poet Laureate of Vancouver, and I've been writing poetry for over 20 years. I have spent much of my life in the city of Vancouver, but my early years were in a rural environment where we grew our own food, raised pigs and chickens and cows, and lived simply with a deep connection to the land, as many do here in Iowa. So I'm delighted to be here today to share some of what we're doing in Vancouver, Canada, my birth city. We are a city of diverse cultures, belief systems, and economic backgrounds, and like any big urban center, we have our problems. Polls by the Vancouver Foundation have shown that Vancouverites believe alienation and disconnection are our most pressing social issues. This is interesting because Vancouver is the second most expensive city in the world in which to buy a house relative to income, but that's not what people are most concerned about. The fact that our citizens cited alienation and social disconnection as their most pressing issue is telling. I had that one fact in mind when I applied for the position of Poet Laureate. I knew that if I were to receive the position, I wanted a project that would truly engage all the people of my city, not just other poets. A project that would bring mindfulness and creativity to the way we eat and honor those who nourish us. I'd like to begin by reading a few lines from a poem by one of your great poets, Muskokie American poet Joy Harjo. The poem is called Perhaps the World Ends Here. It begins, "The world begins at a kitchen table. No matter what, we must eat to live. The gifts of creation are bought and prepared, set on the table. So it has been since creation, and it will go on." The poem ends with these lines, "Perhaps the world will end at the kitchen table while we are laughing and crying, eating of the last sweet bite." Today, I want to talk about food literacy and poetic literacy in the context of the poetry projects I'm doing, along with my team of poetry ambassadors in Vancouver. Specifically, I want to speak about how food literacy and poetic literacy can help heal some of society's most pressing social issues and help make our communities healthier, stronger, smarter, and kinder, whether the individuals involved are on the giving or the receiving end of the poetic collaborations. As Joy Harjo says, no matter what, we must eat to live. All of us carry memories of those first foods we ate, the foods that taste like home. Everyone has something to say about food, whether it's the activist challenging the cruelties of conventional farming, the exile remembering the waft of spices on lost streets, or the First Nations elder sharing Indigenous food traditions with the next generation. Food is personal, political, and powerful. Eating mindfully and writing poetry about food engages all the senses, challenges the intellect, and connects us with something greater than ourselves. So I'd like to share my invitation to Vancouverites with you. Here it is. It's time to champion and celebrate those who grow, catch, or make food for our city. Chefs, bakers, fishers, butchers, grocers, farmers and farm workers, craft beer makers, beekeepers, or even grandparents with coveted family recipes. All of these and more. Start with an interview or with a food producer, take a few photographs, learn about what they do, and then write it up as a poem. Be it an ode to a cinnamon bun, a sonnet about sushi, a haiku about halibut, a prose poem about pierogies, a ballad to bees, a chant about chow mein, or a rant about raspberries. Submit your collaborative writing piece to Sweet Verse, celebrating Vancouver's culinary and literary heritage, a project of Vancouver's new poet laureate, me. Why do I think poetry is one of the best ways to examine our relationship to food? Because poetry is difficult. It demands your full attention. It demands you look deeply with unflinching eyes at what is. And it also allows you the freedom to dream of what could be. So let's look at what is. The U.S. is number one in so many beautiful and important and exemplary ways, like volunteering, as Hugh was mentioning. I think no country in the world has more volunteers than America. But the U.S. is also number one in some tragic and negative ways. Today's children are the first generation whose life expectancy is less than that of their parents, and this is tragic. According to the Harvard School of Public Health, sugary drinks such as soda pop are the top calorie source in teens' diets. This is followed by pizza. Clearly, this is a public health disaster. Clearly, change is needed. And I'm sorry if I inhibit you from taking seconds today from this delicious lunch. I don't mean to do that. So I'd like to talk about another area where the U.S. is, again, unfortunately, at the top. And I won't read through this, you can take a look on your own. But I do want to say that in 2010, enough painkillers were prescribed in the U.S. to medicate every single American adult around the clock for a month, according to Physicians for Responsible Opioid Prescribing. Americans are more likely to try illegal drugs than any other citizens in the world, according to the World Health Organization. Clearly, this is another ticking time bomb. To speak with some restraint here, there is room for improvement. So why are people in well-off democracies struggling with addiction and obesity? To search for answers to that question, I turned to Vancouver addictions doctor Gabor Mate, who wrote the book In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, Close Encounters with Addiction. As he said this year on the Huffington Post, and I quote, "The chief reason we condemn drug users so vehemently may be simply that we do not wish to see our similarities to them. We want to perceive our own forms of self-soothing as somehow morally superior, or we just do not want to recognize how much our entire way of life resembles the frantic search for relief of the user. I define addiction as any behavior that, for the short term, we crave or find relief and pleasure in, but we're unable to give up despite the negative consequences incurred in the long term. By that standard, how many of us are not addicted?" I find this very interesting. As Dr. Mate's website points out, in reality, there's only one addiction process, its core objective being the self-soothing of deep-seated fears and discomforts. Turning to the neurobiological roots of addiction, Dr. Mattei presents an astonishing array of evidence showing conclusively that addictive tendencies arise in the parts of our brains governing some of our most basic and life-sustaining needs and functions: incentive, motivation, physical and emotional pain relief, the regulation of stress, and the capacity to feel and receive love. These brain circuits develop or don't develop largely under the influence of the nurturing environment in early life. Therefore, addiction represents a failure of these crucial systems to mature in the way nature intended. I add that the great good news from Dr. Mattei's and other neurology research is that the human brain continues to develop new circuitry throughout the lifespan, giving hope for people mired in addictive patterns. So, if we're open to the hypothesis that addiction is caused by neurobiological processes gone awry in early childhood, and that they can be rewired with care and effort on behalf of both the individuals and their healers later in life, then our most basic assumptions about those who are addicted or obese are called into doubt. So, Johann Hari, author of Chasing the Scream, The First and Last Days of the War on Drugs, had this to say, and I quote again: "A heroin addict has bonded with heroin because she couldn't bond as fully with anything else. So the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. It is human connection." Hari goes on to challenge us all to approach those who struggle with addiction differently. He says, the writer George Monbiot has called this the age of loneliness. We've created human societies where it is easier for people to become cut off from all human connection than ever before. Bruce Alexander, the creator of Rat Park, told me that for too long we've talked exclusively about individual recovery from addiction. We now need to talk about social recovery, how we all recover together from the sickness of isolation that is sinking on us like a thick fog. But this new evidence isn't just a challenge to us politically. It doesn't just force us to change our minds. It forces us to change our hearts. So, what makes a city a happy and connected place? For answers to that, I turn to another Vancouver writer who has much to teach us, Charles Montgomery. As is said about his book, and I quote again, "The life-shaping power of urban design isn't always obvious, but design has huge consequences for people, the economy, and the planet. The good news? The happy city, the green city, and the low-carbon city are the same place, and everyone can help build it." So I have a short excerpt I want to read to you from Happy City. Just before the crash of 2008, a team of Italian economists tried to account for that seemingly inexplicable gap between rising income and flatlining happiness in the U.S. The Italians tried removing various components of economic and social data from their models and found that the only factor powerful enough to hold down people's self-reported happiness in the face of all that wealth was the country's declining social capital, the social networks and interactions that keep us connected with others. It was even more corrosive than the income gap between rich and poor. As much as we complain about other people, there's nothing worse for mental health than a social desert. The more connected we are to family and community, the less likely we are to experience heart attacks, strokes, cancer, and depression. Connected people sleep better at night. They live longer. They consistently report being happier. That's the end of that quote. Okay, so how to bring some of this together and promote change. Here's my city. So I was struck on my recent wonderful trip to Chicago by something entirely new to my eyes. I saw many homeless people on the street with signs asking for assistance. That was nothing new. We see that in every major big city, and Vancouver's no exception. But what I saw in Chicago that I'd never seen before was shame. Several times, homeless men wrote out their shame on the signs that they held. "I'm embarrassed," I read. "I'm ashamed to be here. I have kidney failure and I need dialysis. I want to work." That was what struck me as new, the fact that this sick and vulnerable population also suffered from shame. When American ideology is rooted in the myth of the lone individual creating his own success out of nothing, any setback can be compounded by shame. How well is shame working as a preventative strategy for obesity and addiction? As we can see in the United States, not well at all, worse, in fact, than any industrialized nation. So I'm all about personal responsibility and individual freedoms, but I think they're only effective in the presence of strong social and familial ties, of hope for the future, of love and community support. Without these, shaming addicts is simply cruel as well as ineffective. By now, I hope you'll see where I'm headed. These two very influential writers, one an addictions doctor and the other an urban planner, are both taking on the social hazards of disconnection. But I didn't know any of this when I applied for the position of Poet Laureate. I hadn't read those books then. The only thing I'd heard was that one statistic published by the Vancouver Foundation that Vancouverites found social dislocation and alienation their most pressing issue. That was what I wanted to address. Okay. So, as Poet Laureate, I visited the main food banks in Vancouver and been just deeply impressed by the passion of the workers and volunteers there. People in Vancouver are no longer made to queue up outside the food bank, but are rather invited in, giving shopping baskets and encouraged to choose the foods that work best for them and their families. The model in Vancouver is moving toward one of being embraced and supported, elevated by the whole community, not being shamed. So, the City of Vancouver has a number of goals to promote well-being for Vancouverites. I want to talk about just 3 of those goals, and I'm quoting directly from the City of Vancouver's website. Goal 3, feeding ourselves well. The goal is to make sure that Vancouver has a healthy, just, and sustainable food system. So there are all kinds of initiatives in place, from giving vouchers to farmers markets, to people on income assistance, to promoting community gardens, to bringing local fruits and vegetables to classrooms for tastings, to keeping urban chickens and bees. Goal number 10, expressing ourselves. The goal is to make sure that Vancouver has a diverse and thriving cultural ecology that enriches the lives of residents and visitors. And their target there is to increase public participation and community engagements in the arts and culture by 25% over 2014 levels. And the last one I want to bring up is goal number 12, environments to thrive in. Vancouverites have the right to a healthy environment and equitable access to living environments in which they can thrive. And the target there is that every Vancouver neighborhood should have a walk score of at least 70. And you probably already know that the walk score is how easy it is to find everything that you need to live in a neighborhood on foot without a car. These are goals any city could be proud of, policy targets that support both the community and the individual. So my project as Poet Laureate is a modest one with radical roots, and it speaks to all 3 of the City of Vancouver goals above. I want to encourage people in the city of my birth to talk to each other, to engage around growing food, engage in self-expression, and create an environment in which we are well fed culturally as well as physically. I want to mentor emerging writers as they write poetry and prose about eating, about being hungry and not having enough to eat, about feeding a baby, about attending an aged parent who can no longer feed themselves, about feeding the homeless or being the homeless who are fed. This work alone will be a good start. But my more radical goal is to ask us all to look at our lives and the sacrifices we've made socially to survive or to get ahead materially. Are we living a path that does us harm? Are we feeding ourselves and our children as ethically as we are able? Can we do better? What if the Canadian dream, to borrow a phrase from our U.S. neighbors, is making us sick? What if it's not a summer house or owning a house at all that gives meaning to our lives, but making music or art or a community garden or quilting or sharing poetry with friends? Now, I'd like to honor my poetry ambassadors, those who are working with me to engage local citizens in poetry projects about food. We're a loose collective of academics, former publishers, teachers, volunteers, and powerhouse poets from diverse backgrounds who've come together for the common good. From the beginning, I wanted my term as Poet Laureate to be a collective term, and I'm so grateful to have this incredible team to work with me. Indeed, I feel in many ways that Vancouver has a dozen Poets Laureate, not just one. So I want to highlight just a few of the cool projects that the Poetry Ambassadors are doing or have done. Fiona Tinway Lamb edited our call to Vancouverites, the one I read, and connected me with a number of people who run Vancouver's food banks. Linda Prince has been active teaching poetry in the schools as a dedicated and passionate volunteer week after week after week. Ellie Kralji Gardner runs a writing collective on the downtown east side called Thursdays. Her Sustain and Nourish project plans include reading at the food bank, a visit from Hives for Humanity to write about honey and bees, and planning literary verses and courses dinners of social writing. Another poetry ambassador, Jamie McCarty, will offer workshops this fall focusing on poetry's relationship to food. Yet another ambassador, Annie Ross, a professor of First Nation Studies at Simon Fraser University, is working with me on poetic collaborations about salmon and poetry. All right. Yet another ambassador, poet Ray Sarojini Saklakar, is working with bee scientist Mark Winston, a biologist and author of Bee Time, Lessons from the Hive. They paired up with this amazing organization called Hives for Humanity to do collaborative community poetry projects and honey tastings, and they've just been magnificent. Now, I just want to speak briefly about Hives for Humanity. They're a nonprofit organization that encourages community connections through apiculture, more commonly known as beekeeping. And I quote, "Through mentorship-based programming, we create flexible opportunities for people to engage in the therapeutic culture that surrounds the hive. We foster connectivity to nature and to each other. We participate in local, sustainable economies. We support at-risk populations of people and pollinators, and we do so with respect and joy." Hives for Humanity is this amazing mother-daughter team, and they're doing exactly what I help to promote and to sing the praises of in poems. And I've been at a couple of their honey tasting events, and what's remarkable is you can taste the difference of the honey in different neighborhoods. It's a different color, it has a different flavor, and these are all in some of our most difficult and dangerous neighborhoods, and here we have just incredible things happening. One wonderful thing that the Poetry Ambassadors have been doing is having teams of poets in conjunction with the Parks Board and Vancouver Public Libraries hit the farmers markets to offer to write fresh, local, food-inspired poems for people shopping there. I've been away this fall, but I've heard it's been a blast. Here they are in one of the farmers markets. We have them all over the city. And here are two of them, Kevin Spence and Renee Saklakar, and you can see how much fun they're having. I've also teamed up with poetry ambassadors such as Karen Schlanka and Julie Okot-Bitek to do food-inspired poetry workshops in places such as senior homes and the Native Education College. Another poetry ambassador, Hart Bannock, a professor at UBC and the founder of the festival Wild About Vancouver that promotes outdoor education for all ages, invited me and poetry ambassador Nwatilo Mawayu to give our first poetry workshops outside in the woods to student teachers. We used that sacred space as our classroom, and we forsake the walls altogether. And that was a bit daunting at first, but it was also an amazing learning opportunity for us just to be out in the woods. One last slide. So here are some of the poetry ambassadors in our signature T-shirts, and I'm wearing mine today. They say on the front "Poetry Ambassador" and on the back "Poetry is necessary." Unfortunately, none of the guys were in town that weekend, but we had a great party anyway. So we poetry ambassadors keep learning from each other as connections lead to other connections. The ambassadors that I'm working with are each people with particular skill at building and nurturing community networks, and I learn from them every day. This is an area in which I wish to grow stronger, and I'm grateful to have such mentors around me. I feel us collectively expanding as we exchange poetry and knowledge and engage with other communities. It's a challenge and a joy. For one thing, I am now, like many other Vancouverites, a backyard beekeeper. So why am I here pushing Americans to consider a more Canadian approach to food literacy and social connection? Well, I think I'm in a unique position to do so. I'm a dual Canadian-American citizen. I've lived in both countries, and I've been able to compare how it actually feels to be a citizen of each. No country in the world is more like the U.S. than Canada, and yet we do many things differently. It's worthwhile for each of us to consider from time to time the results. So I have a couple of more very interesting facts I'd like to share with you. Perhaps some of you think that you ought to help poor people because it's the right thing to do, to be charitable. But what if the middle class and the rich ought to work tirelessly to help make society more equal because it's also in their own best interest to do so? What if everyone suffers in unequal societies? In his latest book, The Spirit Level, Why More Equal Societies Almost Always Do Better, epidemiologist Richard Wilkinson and co-author Kate Pickett detail the pernicious effects that inequality has on societies, eroding trust, increasing anxiety and illness, and encouraging excessive consumption. New research shows that among developed countries, the healthiest and happiest are not those with the highest incomes, but with the most equality. For decades, Wilkinson has studied why some societies are healthier than others. He found that what they have in common is not that they have more income, more education, or more wealth, but that what they have is more equitably shared. In fact, it turns out that not only disease, but a whole host of social problems, ranging from mental illness to drug use, are worse in unequal societies. I would argue that despite America's many gifts and strengths and advantages as a superpower, the elevation of individual freedoms and choices above social good has been damaging for both individuals and all classes of society. So now I've addressed some huge social issues: obesity, addiction, urban planning, and the science of happiness. How can poetry writing about food have a measurable impact on these very difficult issues? A poem is such a fragile thing. A poem won't get you money or fame or anything beyond the act of writing and sharing it. How can writing poems about food make any difference? I'd like to mention one further book written by two Americans, Richard Thaler and Cass Sustein, called Nudge. As Amazon says about the book, and I quote, "Every day we make decisions on topics ranging from personal investments to schools for our children, to the meals we eat, to the causes we champion. Unfortunately, we often choose poorly. The reason," the authors explain in this important exploration of choice architecture, is that, being human, we're all susceptible to various biases that can lead us to blunder. Our mistakes make us poorer and less healthy. We often make bad decisions involving education, personal finance, healthcare, mortgages and credit cards, the family, and even the planet itself. Here's an example from the book. Carolyn is a director of food services for a large city school system and is in charge of hundreds of schools. One day, she decides to conduct an experiment in the schools to see whether the way food is displayed has any effect on the food choices of the kids. In some schools, the desserts are placed first, while some have a separate line. In some, carrot sticks are placed at eye level, while French fries were in the others. Simply by altering the position of food items, she was able to increase or decrease the consumption of certain foods by as much as 25%. Carolyn would be called a choice architect, a person responsible for designing the framework in which choices are made. End of quote. Some may object that these are coercive measures and people should be left alone to make their own decisions. I'm not the first to point out that there's no neutral area in which free decisions can be freely made. All of us live in a consumer world where we're pushed by marketing forces to make dozens of decisions about what we eat, drink, and smoke, whether we'll walk to the market or drive to the store, and what we will buy there. We may think we make these decisions freely, but this is simply not the case. Supermarkets nudge us to buy certain products due to where they're placed on the shelf, and donut stores nudge us to buy donuts by wafting greasy sugar scents at us. So there's no neutral, and we're not always capable of making decisions in our own best interest. This is where the moral imperative to include nudges in schools, in communities, and in cities becomes really interesting for me. The city of Vancouver is intent on nudging its people to make healthier choices, whether by installing bike lanes, requiring composting, promoting outdoor education, or advocating social and civic engagement. I'm grateful to live in such a place. Without knowing the term when I began, my Poet Laureate project is a nudge on several levels. I nudge poets to move out of isolation and to write and work collaboratively. I nudge non-poets to think critically and creatively about food and nourishment in poetry. And I nudge disparate groups of citizens to find each other, to read together, interview each other, to write poetry outside together, and to break bread together. A nudge towards social connection through poetry and food cannot by itself solve these difficult social problems, but it can be an honest beginning. I was a volunteer for hospice patients as part of my training to prepare myself to be of use as a writer for those coming to the end of their lives and wanting to make meaning out of what time was left. I had to do many exercises. One of them involved all of us writing our own obituaries and reading them aloud. It was the most moving writing exercise I've ever done. How did we want to be remembered, each of us gathered in that room, prepared to give our time to those whose days on earth were sure to be few? We wanted to be remembered for our connections. We wanted to be remembered for having created deep bonds with those we loved, for having done meaningful work in the world. We didn't want to be remembered as having worked very long hours, neglecting our health and our spouse and our kids. We wanted to be remembered for the baseball games we had coached, the pies we baked, the children we helped to mentor, the art we made. We wanted to be remembered for all the ways we nourished those around us. If you have any doubts, I ask you to spend 30 minutes writing your own obituaries. Nothing is more of a tonic. Nothing is more of a wake-up call to make sure that you're living the life that you should be. When you're doing hospice work, it becomes clear what matters. Addiction, whether to food or to drugs, threatens the values that Americans cherish, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Social science can help implement nudges that do us all good, but creating social connection from social dislocation requires more than a nudge. It requires the goodwill and hard work of a majority of the people in a place. So the last thing I want to mention in terms of new research is the science of awe. According to Psychology Today, researchers describe awe as that sense of wonder we feel in the presence of something vast that transcends our understanding of the world. They point out that people commonly experience awe in nature, but also feel a sense of awe in response to religion, art, and music. Poets know a thing or two about awe. They know that sense of wonder is enough to stop the hands of a clock, to connect us across continents, to unite reader and writer in an experience that transcends language and politics. Those who write poetry provide another entry point into the spiritual and the miraculous, another way of looking at our reason for being here on earth. I think of each poem read, each poem written and shared as a nudge. Are you living your best life? Nudge. Are you living according to your values? Nudge. Are you living generously, nourishing others, and creating a legacy? Nudge. Are you engaging your senses, eating, living, and interacting with the world mindfully? Nudge. Poetry requires mindfulness, and mindfulness is, I believe, the most powerful antidote to the numbing out of addiction, social alienation, disconnection, and mindless overeating. I'd like to close with one poem, and it's called Feast. The table is set with stars. Come to the table. Put away your anger and your guitar. The apples are baking. Tallow drips from candles. Nothing can hold back death. Come to the table. Set your burnt spoon aside in a difficult drawer. Wipe the sin from your mouth. Come as soon as you're able. The wheat's in the barn and the barge, the babe's in the cradle. The history that led to the railway cars is a trunk you can leave at the dock. Unbridle, unsaddle the dappled horse in your great-hearted fable, the horse that you rode to the battle and then to the wars. The salmon's been pulled from the sea and served with its shadow. Come to the table, beloved, the three-legged table, for you are the bell jar's hammer, the broken-down door. What's crooked finds balance on matchbooks and elbows. O prodigal child, O sage of the bluegrass piano, the buckets catch buckshot that falls from a bonfire of stars. You are stabbed in both hands by the bees that you robbed in the grotto. We'll serve honey in moon mist. We'll capture tornadoes in jars. Come to the table. I hope this talk has given you a poetic nudge. You may not know, though you probably do, that Johnson County just hired its very own resident food expert, Shanti Sells, a local farmer. She owns Muddy Miss Farms and is co-manager of Green Share, a group of organic farmers that supplies local businesses here. But what I bet Shanti Sells doesn't yet have, because she just got hired, is a poetry volunteer. Are there any takers here? Nudge, nudge. So whether you work in a community garden and decide to bring poets in, or write poems and decide to connect with a community garden, whether you decide to take a writing class, or volunteer to read poetry in a classroom or seniors center, or start attending poetry readings at Prairie Lights Bookstore, or simply go home this afternoon and sit quietly outside to write a poem on food that you then share with a loved one, I ask you, please, to think about how you might be called to create, connect, and contribute to become ambassadors of poetry, food, and community here in Iowa City. Thank you so much.
You have wonderful goals. What has been the response from the citizens of Vancouver?
Well, it's been a very good response and overwhelming, so I'm really glad to have a number of poets who are working with me. We've been invited to more places than we could possibly manage. It's been interesting, the response from the poets, because many of them are keep sending me poems about food but don't actually want to do the collaboration to sort of step outside their comfort zone. But that's happening as well. It's just been fabulous. It's been very, very exciting, and we have been invited outside of the city of Vancouver to places where they don't yet have a poet laureate, to some of the farmlands, and it just keeps growing and growing. Oh, and I should say also the project was, there was so much enthusiasm that it was chosen to be Canada's national poetry project for this year. So people all over the country were writing about it. So yeah, it's been profound.
I'll ask one. I was thinking about your comments about connections and people isolation, and wondered if you had any thoughts about all the social media that's going on. There's studies being done about how we're connected, but yet we're not connected because of we're not talking to each other except we're texting to each other. And I wonder if that impacts.
Yeah, I think it can be dangerous and it can be good. It depends how it's used. I have 3 kids, and my 2 older ones would text at the table if I let them, and I don't. And they'll also sit with their friends in the living room and text to them. So yeah, I think we need to have limits and we need to have restraint. It can be a wonderful way of connecting, but I don't feel that it's a nourishing way of connecting in the same way that sitting down and sharing a meal or doing a poetry reading is. You don't have that kind of face-to-face bond. So no, I don't think it feeds us in the same way.
So this question, I appreciate the grassroots approach you suggest for Iowa City and Johnson County. Are there any top-down structures you suggest, or any infrastructure changes happening in Vancouver? Top-down.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of top-down approaches, and it makes things so much easier to not have to be good in order to do these things, but to have the leadership lead and do them, and then to be able to follow. So it's not an individual choice of, am I going to volunteer? Am I going to donate some of my money to feed the hungry? But to have the leadership do it and then to sort of fall into place, I think the top down is essential. And yes, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, we'll conclude our program now. On behalf of the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council, I give a big thank you to Rachel Rose for her presentation. I also thank our sponsors, the UI's international programs, the UI's honors program, the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization for their generous support. And we also thank our financial sponsors for today, Karen and Wallace Chapel and Midwest One Bank. And Rachel, as a small token of our appreciation, we present you with the coveted Iowa City Foreign Relations Council mug.
Woohoo!
Thank
Thank you
you
so
very
much.
much.
Thank you. That's great.
We are adjourned. Thank you.
That's wonderful.
My company is Creations by Oz. I'm a jewelry designer. I sell to boutiques and wineries, and I do a lot of custom work, and the people have asked me to come to the markets to actually pick up their items so that they can shop. It was very interesting. I moved here about a year ago, and I've never done any markets in my life with my business. So it's been a really awesome experience for me, but it's just all very new, and it's really neat to get that kind of feedback, which I normally wouldn't have gotten. So I'm here for a unique reason. My customers wanted me here.